He just wanted a warm cup of coffee. But within minutes, strangers laughed at him. And then the entire cafe went dead silent. It was a Thursday morning in Maple Brew, a cozy little coffee shop tucked in a tree-lined strip mall on the edge of suburban Ohio. A spring drizzle tapped softly against the wide glass windows, distorting the neat rows of parked cars into a watercolor of chrome and red taillights. Inside, the place buzzed with the rhythms of modern life. Phone calls on speaker, the staccato clicking of laptop keys, the gentle hum of a cappuccino machine doing its work. The air was thick with the scent of cinnamon buns and dark espresso, making even the most hurried customers pause for a moment as they stepped in from the chill. At a corner table, a group of 3 young professionals, pressed slacks, smartwatches, and hair still damp from the morning shower, were locked in their own little world. Their voices hovered just above a whisper, but there was something sharp and self-satisfied in their laughter that cut through the comfort of the shop. That was the atmosphere Walter Briggs walked into, a place that prided itself on community, but rarely noticed the outsiders at its margins. Walter moved slowly, each step measured, as if the polished hardwood beneath him were a minefield. At 78, he was slim and slightly hunched, but there was a quiet force to the way he carried himself, a gravity that seemed to come from somewhere deep within. He wore a plain navy coat buttoned to the top, faded at the cuffs. Pinned near his lapel was a small, worn Marine Corps insignia, its gold edges dulled by time and touch. To most, he looked like any other old man from the neighborhood, maybe a little more dignified, maybe a little more tired. Walter paused just inside the door, savoring the smell of coffee and fresh bread. For a moment he closed his eyes and let the warmth wash over him. In his mind, the simple pleasure of this place, a chair by the window, the chatter of strangers, the safety of routine, was a peace hard-earned. He shuffled to the counter, glancing up at the chalkboard menu, more out of habit than need. He ordered a black coffee, voice steady but soft, and reached into his pocket for change. As he did, his gaze caught on a small framed photograph behind the counter, a grainy black and white shot of young Marines, arms slung around each other, grinning at the camera. He smiled faintly. "Nice photo," he said, but the barista, a young woman with anxious eyes and a tangle of blonde hair, barely looked up from the register. "That'll be $2.25, she said, trying not to sound rushed. Walter hesitated, feeling suddenly awkward. He cleared his throat. Do you still honor the veterans discount? 25 cents off?" His words came out quietly, but the I seemed to hang in the air for a long second. The barista frowned, biting her lip. I think we usually need a veteran's card or something. Like proof?" Her words came out uncertain, almost apologetic, as if she was trying to be gentle and official at the same time. Walter nodded, producing his pin between thumb and forefinger. "Lost it last week. That pin's from '68. Kei-san." His tone was neither proud nor defensive, just stating a fact, a memory worn smooth by repetition. The barista offered a nervous smile, glancing back at the register. "I'll have to check with the manager. Sorry." Walter stepped aside, not wanting to cause a scene, and let the next customer in line step forward. The room seemed to close in around him. At the corner table, the trio of young professionals had been listening. One of them, a man with a meticulously trimmed beard and a phone never out of reach, leaned in, voice just loud enough for others to hear. "Bet he's just wearing that pin to get a discount," he smirked. The woman next to him stifled a laugh, and the third, tapping on his phone, added, "Yeah, my uncle tried that trick once too." Can't blame him, though. Senior discounts add up. Their words had a bite to them, the kind of casual microaggression that could easily pass as banter. They were not meant for confrontation, only for the comfort of their own clique. But in the stillness that followed, their laughter sounded harsher than they intended. Walter heard every word. He said nothing, simply looked down at his hands curled around the paper cup. His coffee sat untouched, steam curling upward like a memory dissolving into thin air. He thought of other mornings, ones that started with the shriek of mortars, the shouts of men, the taste of fear and mud thick in his mouth. This, by comparison, was easy. This was just indifference. He stared into his coffee, the world outside the window blurring as the drizzle became rain. A car alarm sounded somewhere in the parking lot, briefly disrupting the cafe's equilibrium, then faded. Someone at a nearby table coughed and pulled their jacket tighter, glancing at Walter with an expression somewhere between curiosity and embarrassment. The barista returned, this time accompanied by the manager, who offered a tight, forced smile and a dismissive shake of her head. "Sorry, sir. We do need to see a card for that. Company policy." She handed Walter his coffee, careful not to meet his eyes. Walter nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He took his cup and retreated to a table by the window, sitting alone with his thoughts. Outside, the rain intensified, turning the parking lot into a patchwork of puddles and glimmering streetlights. Behind him, the three young professionals grew bolder, laughter swelling as if to push him further into the shadows. "Next, he'll be asking for a free donut," one of them muttered, loud enough that this time a few other customers turned to look. But Walter simply sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the rain, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. To the others, he was invisible. To himself, he was simply tired. He remembered the chaos of Kaie-san, the feel of another man's arm slung over his shoulder as he dragged him through mud and gunfire. He remembered promises made and promises kept, and the faces of men he'd never see again. This coffee shop was not a battlefield, but it had its own kind of coldness, one that crept into the bones. Then, without warning, the door chimed. A sharp, bright sound that cut through the tension like a bell in church. Heads turned. In walked a tall, broad-shouldered man in a gray hoodie. The sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms, and, on the left bicep, a tattoo of the United States Marine Corps logo. He carried himself with purpose, scanning the room with the alertness of someone used to taking in every detail. He ordered his drink at the counter, voice calm and confident, and as he waited, his eyes landed on Walter. For a moment he simply stared, eyes narrowing as if trying to place a face from an old photograph. Then, slowly, a look of recognition dawned. In that instant, the entire cafe seemed to hold its breath. The door had barely finished swinging shut when the room seemed to freeze. The tall man in the Marine Corps hoodie stood just inside the threshold, rain dripping from his sleeves, and looked straight at Walter. The conversation and clatter that had filled Maple Brew a moment earlier faded into a strange, heavy quiet. He took a step forward, coffee forgotten at the counter. His eyes didn't waver from Walter, sharp, observant, almost searching for confirmation. The barista called out his name. "Ethan!" But he barely registered her voice. The young professionals at the corner table exchanged uncertain glances. The smirk that had played on the bearded man's lips was gone now, replaced by a vague discomfort he couldn't quite hide. For the first time that morning, their jokes seemed to have dried up. Even the manager, who'd just finished brushing off Walter's request, found herself inching toward the back room, suddenly absorbed in something on her clipboard. Ethan moved with purpose, his boots thudding quietly on the floor. He stopped 2 paces from Walter's table, hesitated as if weighing the right words, then asked in a voice that was both respectful and full of awe, "Excuse me, sir, were you 3rd Battalion? 68? Walter looked up, startled. His eyes narrowed for a second, studying the younger man. He noticed the calluses on his knuckles, the way he stood with weight evenly balanced, habits that only came from years of discipline. Walter nodded slowly. "Yes, I was." A slow, almost disbelieving grin spread across Ethan's face. Without another word, he came to attention and gave a crisp, textbook salute. The gesture was sudden, almost jarring in its formality, and yet it was charged with something deeply personal, a connection that ran far beyond this rainy morning. "My granddad told me about you," Ethan said, lowering his hand but keeping his posture rigid. Said you carried 2 men through enemy fire at Kaie-san. Whispering Walt, right?" For a moment, time seemed to bend. The image of a forgotten old man slumped over his coffee faded, replaced by something steadier, something proud and unbreakable. Walter blinked hard, not trusting himself to speak. The memories rose unbidden. A jungle at dusk, the thunder of artillery, the faces of men terrified and determined all at once. He remembered how every instinct had told him to run, but instead, he'd crawled and dragged and carried, whispering encouragement into bloodied ears, promising survival in a world gone mad. The entire cafe was silent now. Conversations had died out mid-sentence. Even the espresso machine hissed more quietly, as if it too were listening. Customers craned their necks to see, some with confusion, others with dawning understanding. The three professionals sat rigid, trying to look anywhere but at Walter and Ethan. Walter's voice finally came, quiet but resolute. "Didn't think anyone still remembered," he said. Been a long time since anyone asked about those days." Ethan's expression softened. He drew a battered photograph from his wallet, a black and white shot of a younger man with a broad smile, a marine cap tipped low, and a young, strong Walter in the background. "That's my granddad, Mason Perry. He always talked about you, sir. Said he wouldn't have made it home if not for you. He called you the bravest man he ever met." Walter's hands trembled just slightly as he took the photo, his fingers tracing the faces as if they were relics from another world. "Mason Perry," he breathed. "He had a wicked curveball and a laugh that could wake the dead." Ethan smiled, his eyes glistening. "He passed a few years back, but he never forgot. He made sure we didn't either." There was a beat of silence. Then, quietly, Ethan turned to the barista and manager, his tone now gentle but firm. "Put his coffee on my tab. In fact, let me buy breakfast for him." His gaze flicked over to the trio in the corner, and he added, "And I'd appreciate it if folks showed a little more respect in here." The bearded man cleared his throat, face burning with shame. The woman with him stared at her phone, cheeks flushed. The third man mumbled an apology, almost inaudible. Walter tried to deflect the attention. "No need to make a fuss, son. I just came in for a quiet cup. That's all." Ethan shook his head, unwavering. With respect, sir, you've earned a little fuss." For the first time since he'd stepped into Maple Brew, Walter saw genuine acknowledgement in the eyes around him. The manager shuffled over, hands wringing nervously. I'm so sorry, sir. Didn't realize. If there's anything you need, coffee, food, whatever, it's on the house today. Thank you for your service." Walter nodded politely, not quite comfortable with the sudden spotlight, but appreciating the shift in mood. He offered Ethan a seat, and for the first time in years he found himself talking about the past, not because he wanted attention, but because he wanted to honor the memory of those who never got to come home. They spoke in low voices, trading stories and memories. Ethan asked about Quezon, about the men Walter had carried through fire, about what it was like coming home to a country that often seemed to have moved on without them. Walter's answers were spare, not bitter, but honest. He described the heat and chaos, the bonds forged under fire, the quiet pain of remembering too much. The rest of the cafe listened in, some openly, some pretending to focus on their screens, but unable to resist glancing over. Even the young professionals found themselves drawn in, the usual smugness on their faces replaced by humility and discomfort. One of them finally stood and walked over, clearing his throat. "Sir, I just want to say, I'm sorry for the way we acted earlier. Wasn't right." Walter looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Takes a good man to admit when he's wrong. Appreciate it." As the morning wore on, the rain began to let up, and sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting warm, golden beams through the window. The cafe slowly returned to life. But something fundamental had changed. Where there had been mockery and dismissal, there was now respect, and even a touch of awe. Walter finished his coffee, feeling the warmth settle deep into his bones. He knew tomorrow would bring more challenges, more moments of being overlooked or misunderstood. But for today, in this small cafe in Ohio, he felt seen. Not just as an old man, but as someone whose life and sacrifices mattered. Ethan stood to leave, offering his hand. "Thank you, sir, for everything." Walter shook it, the old strength still there in his grip. "Thank you, son, for remembering. That means more than you know." As Ethan exited, he left behind a ripple, an unspoken challenge to everyone in the room to look twice, to ask questions, to never assume they knew the battles someone else had fought. And as Walter gazed out at the clearing sky for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, the world was ready to remember. The hum of maple brew slowly returned, but it was no longer the same idle soundtrack as before. Where once the cafe had been just another stop on a weekday routine, now there was an air of respect, of curiosity even, lingering in every corner. Walter, though grateful for the newfound attention, found himself wrestling with a familiar unease. It wasn't that he disliked being noticed. It was more that, for so long, he'd grown used to blending into the background, unseen and unremarkable. Ethan's seat was still warm when the barista, her hands shaking slightly, returned with a plate of fresh cinnamon rolls and a refill for Walter's coffee. Both on the house. She set them on the table with a shy smile, her eyes finally meeting his for the first time since he'd arrived. "I hope you like these, sir. They just came out of the oven." Walter thanked her, and for a moment there was an awkward pause as she lingered, unsure if she should say more. In the end, she simply nodded and hurried away, but not before glancing back at him, her cheeks tinged with embarrassment and something like admiration. A few seats over, the trio of young professionals sat in uneasy silence. Their laughter was gone, replaced by quiet conversation and an occasional glance toward Walter's table. The bearded man, still red-faced from his earlier apology, seemed unable to focus on his phone. He fidgeted with his watch, looked out the window, and at one point seemed on the verge of getting up to speak with Walter again, but thought better of it. Walter took a careful sip of coffee, letting the bitterness ground him. The cinnamon roll was soft and sweet, its warmth spreading through him. For a while, he let the sensory details fill the silence, the way the sugar stuck to his fingers, the sound of chairs scraping on tile, the flicker of sunlight dancing across the counter as the storm finally broke outside. It had been years since he'd spoken at length about Kebi-san, or even worn his Marine Corps pin in public. He'd learned the hard way, in the decades after coming home, that not everyone wanted to know what those years had done to a man. Some couldn't handle the truth. Others simply didn't care. So he'd folded those memories deep inside, pulling them out only in rare moments, at reunions, or at the grave of a friend, or in the company of someone like Ethan, who understood what it meant to survive, when so many did not. He thought of Mason Perry again, the photograph Ethan had shown him, two grinning young men in jungle fatigues, full of hope and fear, reminded Walter of all the men who had once filled his world with laughter, bravado, and the unspoken promise that they'd all get out alive. Sometimes, in dreams, he heard their voices calling out to him, urging him to keep moving, to keep fighting. Sometimes he woke with a taste of red dust and cordite on his tongue. A subtle change in the cafe's energy pulled Walter from his reverie. The barista had returned, this time joined by the manager, who had found the courage to approach him again. She wore a hesitant smile, her voice low enough that only Walter could hear. "Sir, if you'd ever like to share more, my own father served, though he never talked much about it. I think it's important for people to know." Walter nodded, surprised by the offer. "Thank you," he replied quietly. "Maybe someday. It's not easy, but maybe someday." The conversation was interrupted by the entrance of another customer, an older woman bundled in a raincoat, her umbrella dripping water onto the mat. She paused as she caught sight of Walter, her eyes lingering on his pin, before she continued on to the counter. Walter watched her, wondering if she, too, carried stories locked away. If the world had any idea how many quiet heroes walked among them, hiding in plain sight. He finished the cinnamon roll, his thoughts drifting. For a moment he allowed himself to remember not just the horrors of war, but the moments of joy that had made survival possible, the letters from home, the jokes that broke the tension, the unbreakable bond of men united by purpose and fear. He glanced outside as the rain eased, sunlight streaming through the glass, illuminating the tiny flecks of dust that danced in the air. There was a clarity in that light, a sense of possibility, of forgiveness, of beginnings after endings. Walter straightened in his seat, feeling the old strength settle in his chest. As he reached for his cup, he caught the eyes of the young professional who had apologized earlier. The man hesitated, then approached Walter's table with a humble expression. "Sir, I know I said it before, but I want to say it right. I'm sorry for the way we talked earlier. My grandfather served too, but I never really understood what that meant. I think I was just trying to be funny. Didn't mean any harm." Walter regarded him with a steady gaze. "It takes guts to admit when you're wrong," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You didn't mean harm, but words have weight. They can lift a man up or cut him down." The young man nodded, his eyes shining with genuine regret. "Thank you for your service, sir. I'll remember that." As he walked away, Walter felt a sense of closure. He knew that not every slight could be undone, not every scar healed by an apology. But moments like this mattered. They added up, quietly shaping the world into something a little more compassionate, a little more aware. Across the room, Ethan had returned, his coffee now in hand, his posture more relaxed. He sat back down at Walter's table, a grateful smile on his face. "Thought I'd lost you," he joked, nodding at the empty plate. "Guess the cinnamon rolls here are worth sticking around for." Walter chuckled, the sound deep and warm. Not bad, but not quite as good as chow in the mess tent. They shared a companionable silence, each lost in his own thoughts. Then Ethan leaned in, voice low. "You know, there's a lot of folks who would love to hear your story, not for the glory or the headlines, just to remember what real courage looks like. My family, we wouldn't be here if not for you. Sometimes I think we forget how much we owe." Walter shook his head. "No one owes me anything. Just remember the ones who didn't make it home. That's all I ask." As the morning wore on, customers filtered in and out, but the mood had shifted. There was an undercurrent of respect now, a shared sense that beneath the surface of everyday life, there were stories worth honoring. Walter looked around and realized he wasn't invisible anymore. He was a thread in the fabric of the community, woven in by courage, sacrifice, and the willingness of others to remember. And as he sat with Ethan, sunlight warming his face, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, the world was starting to change. One cup of coffee, one story, one act of respect at a time. Walter and Ethan sat together, sunlight now flooding the maple brew, softening every sharp edge of the morning. For a brief time, it was as if the world had slowed, the weight of old wounds and new respect mixing together like cream swirling through black coffee. Walter found himself sharing small stories, not the big, headline moments, but the quieter memories. He spoke of a friend who carried a harmonica everywhere, even into combat, and played it softly in foxholes to drown out the distant thunder of artillery. He spoke of the time he and a few others had snuck a dog into camp and for one absurd night forgot there was a war outside the wire. The laughter that came was gentle, tinged with loss, but real all the same. Ethan listened, completely absorbed, sometimes nodding, sometimes just letting the words fill the space between them. You make it sound almost normal," he said quietly, almost in disbelief. Walter shrugged. It was life. People find ways to live, even in hell. Sometimes it's the smallest things that keep you going. Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden movement at the cafe's entrance. An older man, late 60s, sharp blue eyes, and a neat silver mustache, stepped inside. He wore a VFW cap and a windbreaker stitched with faded patches. The moment he spotted Walter, his face broke into a wide, toothy grin. "Briggs," he called, his voice booming across the room. Several customers turned, startled. The man strode over, ignoring the curious stares, and gave Walter a hearty slap on the back. "You old son of a gun, I heard you'd wandered in here today." Walter smiled, genuinely pleased. "Frank Murphy, you old troublemaker. What brings you out this early?" Frank slid into the seat next to Walter without waiting for an invitation, nodding respectfully at Ethan. "Heard through the grapevine you were in town, and I see you're already stirring up memories." Ethan shook Frank's hand, a sense of admiration in his gaze. "Good to meet you, sir. You served with Mr. Briggs?" Frank let out a bark of laughter. "Served with him? He's the only reason I'm still around to drink bad coffee. Back in '68, he dragged me out of a crater, patched me up, and chewed out our lieutenant. All before breakfast." "The man's a legend." Walter rolled his eyes, but a small, shy smile crept across his lips. Frank always did have a way of making things sound bigger than they were. Frank turned serious, voice lowering. "They were big, Walt. You can't keep hiding from that." As the two men traded memories, some lighthearted, some heavy, a small crowd began to gather. A few regulars edged closer, pretending to be interested in the day's pastry selection, but clearly listening. The manager lingered nearby, hoping to catch more of the conversation. Even the trio of young professionals now watched, no longer with embarrassment, but with an open curiosity, and the quiet respect reserved for moments that matter. Suddenly, the cafe's owner, a middle-aged woman with streaks of gray in her hair, emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She paused, surveying the scene, and then approached Walter's table. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, "but if you're willing, would you mind sharing a little with us? My son is thinking of joining the Marines. I want him to understand what it really means." Walter hesitated. Public speaking had never been his strength. Yet something in the room, a sense of community, a hunger for truth, gave him courage. He looked at Frank, then at Ethan, and finally nodded. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of every eye in the cafe. "I'm no hero," he began, his voice modest but clear. "I was just a kid from Cleveland who signed up because it seemed like the right thing to do. War isn't like the movies. It's messier, scarier, and sometimes it changes you in ways you can't predict. But it also teaches you what it means to look out for the person next to you. It teaches you the value of every day, every laugh, every friend." He paused, searching for the right words. "If your son joins, make sure he knows it's not about glory. It's about service, about coming home with your head held high. Not because you did something big, but because you did your part, no matter how small." The cafe was so quiet that even the hum of the refrigerator sounded like thunder. The owner nodded, eyes glistening. "Thank you, sir. I think that's exactly what he needs to hear." Frank, always quick to lighten the mood, raised his cup. "To those who served, and to those who still do." A chorus of murmured agreements followed. Someone in the back, an elderly woman in a flowered blouse, added, "And to those who never got the welcome they deserved." Walter felt a lump in his throat. The moment was bittersweet, filled with pride and pain in equal measure. He looked around and realized that, for perhaps the first time since he'd returned from Vietnam, he wasn't carrying his memories alone. Outside, the rain had fully stopped. Children raced past the windows, splashing in puddles. The world moved on, as it always did. But something had shifted within the small cafe. Old wounds had been acknowledged, and a community had been reminded that history was not a distant thing, but lived and carried in the hearts of the people beside them. The owner handed Walter a folded note as she passed. "Why?" "From my son," she whispered. "He wanted to say thanks." Walter opened it, his hands trembling just slightly. The note was simple. "Thank you for showing me what a real hero looks like. I hope I can be half as brave as you someday." For a long moment, Walter sat quietly, letting the words settle. The shame, the loneliness, the feeling of being invisible, all of it faded, replaced by something stronger. Gratitude, belonging. Frank clapped him on the shoulder. "You see, Walt, you're not alone. You never were. Ethan stood, as if preparing to leave, but then hesitated. Sir, before I go, I wanted to ask, would you ever come speak at my daughter's school? She's in 7th grade, and they're learning about the Vietnam War. I think it would mean the world to them to hear from someone who lived it, not just read about it in a textbook. Walter considered the request, feeling both nervous and honored. I'll think about it, he promised. If it helps them understand, maybe it's time I started sharing more. Ian, Frank winked. Just don't let him tell them about the time he tried to cook sea rations with a Zippo lighter. Nearly set the jungle on fire. Laughter filled the cafe, easy and genuine, breaking the last of the morning's tension. For once, Walter allowed himself to relax completely, feeling the warmth of community and friendship, an invisible armor stronger than anything he'd ever worn in war. And so, in a humble coffee shop in suburban Ohio, the stories of sacrifice and courage wove themselves into the fabric of the present, refusing to be forgotten. As the morning drifted into afternoon, Walter realized that sometimes being remembered was the greatest honor of all. The laughter from Frank's joke still lingered in the air as the afternoon pressed on, bringing a steady stream of customers through the doors of Maple Brew. Walter found himself at the center of a quiet circle of attention. An old man in a plain coat, suddenly regarded with new respect, yet, as the warmth of acceptance grew around him, Walter also felt a stirring of old ghosts. The simple act of telling a story, of letting memories breathe in the open air, was at once liberating and dangerous, for some things, once awakened, refused to return to silence. The small crowd began to thin as people drifted back to their routines. Frank was recounting an old fishing story to the barista, animatedly gesturing with a plastic stirrer. Ethan lingered at Walter's table, a little more reserved now, his posture thoughtful. Walter looked around, taking in the quiet transformations of the cafe. The trio of young professionals had finally gotten up to leave. As they passed Walter's table, the bearded one stopped, fished a business card from his wallet, and laid it gently on the table. If you ever want to talk about veterans' benefits, sir, I work at the county office. No more jokes. I promise. Walter offered a grateful nod, the gesture simple but meaningful. Thank you, son. That means a lot. As the young man exited, Walter saw a ripple of change. Humility where there had been arrogance, openness replacing indifference. It struck him how the smallest moments, a word, a gesture, a story, could shift the course of a day, or even a life. Ethan, still sitting across from Walter, seemed lost in thought. After a long silence, he spoke. Do you ever regret it, sir? Enlisting? Going through all that? The question surprised Walter. He considered it, the memories crowding in, fear, pain, triumph, brotherhood, loss. I don't regret serving, he answered quietly. I regret the things I couldn't change, the friends I couldn't save, but serving, doing my duty, that's something I'll never regret. Ethan nodded, eyes shining. I wish more people understood that. Sometimes it feels like the world just wants to forget, like history is only what you can find in a textbook, not something living and breathing among us. Walter let the words settle, then offered a small smile. You're proof that's not true. So is everyone who's listening today? At that, a young woman who'd been sitting by the window gathered her courage and approached. She was college-aged, shy, clutching a worn leather journal to her chest. Excuse me, sir, she began, her voice trembling just a little. I'm studying American history, and, well, I heard some of your story. Would you mind if I wrote about you? Yeah, no, about today? About your service? Walter's first instinct was to wave her off, modesty and habit pulling him back. But he saw something in her eyes, not the gaze of someone seeking to exploit his story, but a genuine hunger to understand. Oh, he nodded. If it helps you tell the truth, then yes. But remember, it's not about me. It's about all of us who served and those who never made it home. She smiled, visibly relieved. Thank you, sir. I'll do my best. Frank, ever the performer, leaned over and whispered, "Just make sure she gets my good side if she's drawing pictures, Walt." The girl laughed, the tension easing, and made a quick sketch in her journal. A few quick lines that captured the quiet dignity of the scene. As the cafe continued to buzz, the owner brought over another pot of coffee and a plate of cookies. "On the house," she said. "And if you'd like to stay for our open mic night, it starts in an hour. Some of our regulars read poetry or share stories. You'd be welcome to join." Walter hesitated. The idea of standing before a crowd, of letting his voice fill the room, made his hands tremble. But then he looked around, at Ethan, at Frank, at the college student with her eager eyes and open journal. He realized that sharing his story was no longer about reliving the past, but about giving others permission to remember, to honor, and to heal. "I'll stay," he said at last, his voice steady. "But only if Frank promises not to embarrass me." Frank grinned. "No promises, brother." As the afternoon faded, the cafe filled with new faces. Neighbors, families, teenagers with skateboards tucked beneath their chairs. The regulars greeted Walter and Frank with friendly nods, some offering quiet thanks, others simply glad to be present for something special. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, as if everyone sensed the boundaries of everyday life were about to stretch. When the open mic began, the first few acts were what one might expect. A high school girl nervously reciting a love poem, a middle-aged man reading a humorous essay about parenting mishaps, a local musician strumming a gentle tune about Ohio's endless skies. But with each performance, the room grew warmer, more attentive. People listened, not just with their ears, but with their hearts. Frank nudged Walter. "You ready?" Walter felt his nerves flare, but also a surprising sense of calm. He stood slowly, leaning just a little on his cane, and made his way to the front of the room. The conversations faded. The overhead lights cast a gentle glow, illuminating the lines etched deep in his face, the Marine Corps pin catching the light. He spoke, not with the force of a practiced orator, but with the plain honesty of a man who had nothing left to prove. "Most of you know me as just another old-timer," he began, "but I came here today for a cup of coffee and left with a reminder. Maybe we're all carrying stories that deserve to be heard." He told them, not of battle or medals, but of small mercies. A friend sharing half a ration, a letter from home, a child's drawing tucked into a muddy pocket. He spoke of what it meant to serve, to lose, to return, and find the world changed, but himself changed even more. He told them about forgiveness, of others, of the world, and of oneself. By the time Walter finished, the room was silent. Tears glimmered in a few eyes, and even Frank sat with his usual wisecracks held in check. A young veteran in the crowd stood and saluted. "Semper Fi, sir," he said softly. Walter saluted back, his hands steady, his heart full. In that moment, the line between past and present vanished. The walls of Maple Brew contained not just a cafe, but the living memory of all who'd walked difficult roads, who'd come home changed and still found the courage to share their truth. And as Walter returned to his seat, surrounded by friends, old and new, he realized that healing was never a solo journey. It happened together, one story, one handshake, one act of respect at a time. The applause for Walter's story lingered like a heartbeat after the open mic ended, filling Maple Brew with a hush that felt sacred. As people returned to their tables, something fundamental had shifted. The cafe, usually just a pit stop on the road of daily life, had become a crossroads, a place where the past and present met, and where old wounds might finally begin to close. Walter settled back at his table, exhaustion mixing with a lightness he hadn't felt in years. His coffee had gone cold, but he didn't mind. What mattered was the energy in the room, the way people now saw him, and maybe even saw each other, a little differently. Frank slid into the seat across from him, nudging a plate of cookies his way. "You did good, Walt. I haven't seen this place that quiet since the espresso machine blew a fuse last year." Walter managed to chuckle, grateful for Frank's ability to bring humor to heavy moments. "You think I scared them off? Or woke them up? Maybe a bit of both," Frank replied, winking. A group of high school students came by, their faces earnest. One of them, a boy in a faded ROTC jacket, spoke up. "Mr. Briggs, sir, thanks for sharing. My dad's in the Army. Sometimes I feel like I don't get what he's gone through. But tonight, I think I understand a little better." Walter smiled and placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Just listen, son. That's half the battle. Your dad will appreciate it more than you know." As the students left, the college-aged woman with the leather journal returned, this time accompanied by her professor, a dignified woman with steel-gray hair and kind eyes. "Mr. Briggs," the professor said, "I teach modern American history at the university. I'd be honored if you would come speak to my class, or even let us record your story. Too many veterans' voices never make it into the textbooks." Walter's instinct was to retreat, to hide behind humility, but he caught Ethan's encouraging glance from a few tables away. The young Marine mouthed, "They need you." And that small gesture tipped the scales. "I'd be honored." "You, ma'am," Walter answered softly. "If my story helps someone understand, then it's worth telling." The professor smiled and handed him a card. "We'll be in touch." "Thank you." With each encounter, Walter felt the tightness in his chest loosening, but not everyone was at ease with the day's events. Across the room, the bearded young professional who had earlier mocked Walter lingered near the exit, wrestling with the urge to stay or flee. At last, he approached, face flushed and words tumbling out. "I was out of line before. I didn't realize. I never stopped to think what that pin meant. My grandfather was a veteran too. And I never really asked him about it." Walter's eyes softened. "You got time. Go ask him. You'll be glad you did." The man nodded, shame and gratitude mingling in his expression. "I will, sir. Thank you for your service and your forgiveness." After the crowd thinned, Walter, Frank, and Ethan found themselves alone at the table. The cafe staff cleaned up quietly, casting respectful glances their way. The open mic had ended, but the air still felt charged with possibility. Frank leaned in, lowering his voice. Walt, maybe it's time we started our own little veterans group. Nothing fancy, just coffee, stories, a place to remember together." Walter hesitated, weighing the idea. The thought of facing his memories in the company of others, of building a space where silence was replaced with understanding, felt both daunting and right. "I think I'd like that," he said at last. "Too many of us walk alone." Ethan tapped the table. "Count me in too. I can help organize, spread the word, maybe partner with the cafe. Make it official." Frank grinned. "Now you're talking. First meeting's on me. Well, as long as it's before noon and the coffee's not more than $2. Walter laughed, the sound surprising and rich. He looked around at his friends, old and new, and realized how much the day had changed him. Where there had been loneliness, there was now a glimmer of community. Where there had been silence, there was now a chorus of voices, eager to listen and to remember. Yet as the night crept in, the cafe emptying and chairs being stacked, Walter felt an undercurrent of anxiety. Sharing his story was healing, yes, but it also brought memories flooding back. Images and sounds he'd tried for decades to keep buried. He excused himself, stepped outside, and let the cool evening air wrap around him. The parking lot was quiet, wet from the day's rain. Walter looked up at the stars, thinking of the men who never made it home. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the old Marine Corps pin, a small, tangible proof of a lifetime. He heard footsteps behind him. It was Ethan, hands in his pockets, face open and honest. "You okay, sir?" Walter nodded. "Just thinking, some memories never really leave you, you know?" Ethan joined him, standing shoulder to shoulder. "I get it. My granddad, he had nightmares until the day he died. But he always said talking about it helped, even when it hurt." Walter smiled faintly. "He was a good man." They stood in silence for a while, The darkness filled with unspoken words. Then Ethan broke it. "Would you come by the VFW hall this weekend? There's a few guys there who'd love to meet you, hear your story. Some of them are struggling, more than they let on." Walter considered it. The old resistance flared, the instinct to keep his pain private. But then he remembered the faces inside Maple Brew, the small miracles of connection and forgiveness that had unfolded over the past hours. He nodded. "I'll come." "Good," Ethan said, relief clear in his voice. "You're making more of a difference than you know, sir." They walked back toward the cafe, the light inside spilling warm across the sidewalk. Walter paused, looking through the window at Frank, who was waving them back in, 2 steaming cups of coffee, waiting. For the first time, it's an hour in decades, Walter felt a hope that ran deeper than any wound. He wasn't just a relic of a forgotten war, or a lonely old man with a story to tell. He was a link in a living chain, one that stretched from the battlefields of the past into the promise of tomorrow. Inside, the cafe was nearly empty, but the feeling of community remained strong. Frank raised his cup in a mock toast. "To old friends, new beginnings, and the stories that keep us going." Walter joined the toast, his heart lighter. He knew that the path ahead would not be easy, that memories would still ache, and some wounds would never fully heal. But he also knew he would never walk alone again. And as they sipped their coffee, laughter and conversation blending with the night air, Walter understood, sometimes. The hardest battles weren't fought on distant fields, but right here, in the heart, where forgiveness, courage, and hope took root. The following days passed in a gentle swirl for Walter. The world outside Maple Brew had not changed. The same gray clouds drifting over Ohio, the same polite nods from neighbors on his slow walks down the block. But inside, Walter felt transformed. The cafe's open mic night had become the talk of the small town. For the first time in years, people stopped him in the grocery store, at church, or even on his porch, wanting to shake his hand or share a memory of someone they'd lost to war. At first, the attention was unsettling. Walter had spent decades building a quiet life, wary of spotlights or expectations. Now, everywhere he turned, he saw eyes that reflected, not pity, but respect. A subtle shift that warmed him, even as it forced him to confront the depth of his own loneliness. Frank, true to his word, called Walter early Saturday morning. "Coffee at the VFW hall, 11 o'clock. Don't be late. I know you move slow, but these guys are even older than you." The familiar tease made Walter smile, and he promised he'd be there. The walk to the hall was longer than Walter remembered. Each step reminded him of his age, the ache in his knee, an old friend now. But he pressed on, taking in the spring air and the birdsong that floated above the traffic. The VFW sat at the edge of a little park, an unassuming brick building with flags fluttering out front. He paused at the door, fingers tracing the metal plaque. "For all who served and all who remember." Inside, the hall buzzed with the easy camaraderie of old soldiers. Laughter echoed off the linoleum floors, mingling with the scent of burnt coffee and aftershave. Some men wore ball caps embroidered with their service. Others simply bore the unmistakable posture of men shaped by discipline and hardship. Frank was already at a table, holding court as usual, and Ethan waved Walter over with a wide, genuine grin. Walter sat, nodding at the faces gathered there. Some familiar, others not. Ethan introduced him to a quiet man named Dennis, a Marine from Desert Storm, who bore deep scars on his cheek and spoke with a gentle, careful voice. To Leroy, an army medic from Afghanistan, whose nervous hands twisted a coin around his knuckles as he listened. And to Carl, a widower whose son had served in Iraq, and who, Walter would later learn, came to the VFW every week just to feel less alone. Conversation began awkwardly, as it often does when men are asked to share more than just weather reports or sports scores. But Frank, never one to let silence settle, nudged Walter. "Tell him about the time you smuggled a puppy through Checkpoint Charlie, or how you rigged up a radio when ours got hit at..." Walter smiled, feeling the old shyness retreat a little. "We had to get creative back then. You never knew what you'd find in a care package, sometimes cookies, sometimes a note, once even a tiny American flag. It's the small things that get you through the big ones. As laughter rippled around the table, something shifted. The younger veterans relaxed, their stories trickling out, slow at first, then with a kind of relief. Dennis spoke about the night terrors that sometimes left him gasping for breath, of how he still woke at every sudden noise. Leroy described patching up soldiers under fire, his hands steady then, but shaky now. Carl, after a long pause, told them about his son's letters home, the last of which had arrived after the funeral. Ethan watched Walter carefully. The room, once so full of bravado, now felt sacred, each man's vulnerability a gift, each memory shared, a small act of defiance against the silence that haunted so many of their days. When it was his turn, Walter hesitated. He had never spoken aloud the truth that gnawed at him most, the memory that visited in the darkest hours of the night. But the faces around him were open, unjudging. So, he began. Khe-Sanh was chaos, Walter said, his voice low. We lost men every day. Sometimes all you could do was hold on to a piece of home, a photo, a promise, a buddy's voice in your ear. The worst was coming home and feeling like nobody understood what you left behind. The world moved on. We were still stuck in that red mud, trying to make sense of it all. He paused, the silence stretching, heavy but not cruel. I spent years pretending nothing was wrong, pushing people away. It's easier to be invisible than to admit you're still fighting battles no one can see. Frank, for once, had nothing to add. Leroy reached across the table, gripping Walter's hand tight. You're not invisible now, he said. Not here. The words broke something open in the room. Stories poured out, not just about war, but about fear, forgiveness, survival. Laughter returned, but it was different now, a sign of healing, not hiding. After coffee, the men stood for a group photo, a new ritual Dennis explained, to prove to themselves and their families that they were still here, still fighting, together. Ethan set the phone's timer and joined them, arms slung over shoulders, grins both awkward and sincere. Smile, Walt, Frank said. You're famous now? Walter did, feeling a strange buoyancy. For the first time, he looked forward to the next gathering, not out of obligation, but hope. The group began to drift apart, some heading home to waiting families, others lingering to talk about VA claims or share news from back home. As Walter walked outside, Ethan caught up. My daughter's teacher called, he said, breathless. They want you to come next week. 7th grade social studies. It'll mean the world to those kids, sir. They need to know history isn't just something in a book. Walter felt a flutter of anxiety. Public speaking, children, the weight of his memories pressing in, but he nodded. I'll be there. If it helps them understand, I'll try. Ethan grinned, clapping him on the shoulder. That's all anyone can ask. On the walk home, Walter's thoughts turned inward. The pride in his chest warred with old fears. What would he say to those children? How could he make them see that courage didn't always look like a hero in a movie, but sometimes like an old man facing his own darkness with honesty? He did not know, but he felt something shift, a faith that perhaps with help he could find the right words. That night, Walter sat at his kitchen table, a blank sheet of paper before him, pen poised above it. He wrote the first words slowly, carefully. Dear students, my name is Walter Briggs. I want to tell you about the people who shaped my life and the battles we still fight, even after the shooting stops. And he stopped, wiped his eyes, and smiled. The wounds were still there, but so was something new, the courage to speak and to heal. And outside, for the first time in a long while, the night felt full of possibility. The following week moved with an odd mixture of anticipation and dread for Walter. Each day, he walked a little further in the spring sunshine, rehearsing what he might say to the 7th graders at Maplewood Middle School. At home, scraps of paper littered his kitchen table. Half-written sentences, fragments of memory, bullet points about courage, loss, and hope. It had been years since he'd spoken in public, and never to a room full of children whose only understanding of war came from textbooks, video games, or the occasional headline. The old ache in his knee was joined by butterflies in his stomach. But he pressed on, reminding himself that sharing mattered more than comfort. When the morning of his talk arrived, Walter dressed carefully, slacks and a clean shirt, Marine Corps pin polished to a warm glow. He took the bus, refusing Ethan's offer of a ride. The day was bright, clouds stacked like cotton above the red brick school. As he climbed the steps and entered the wide hallways, the scent of pencil shavings, floor wax, and cafeteria pizza brought an unexpected smile to his face. Memories flooded back, some painful, some sweet, of his own school days, the world smaller and simpler then. A secretary met him at the door and guided him to the classroom. Through the glass, he saw rows of restless kids, some slouching, some whispering, a few already craning their necks in curiosity. Mrs. Finley, Ethan's daughter's teacher, greeted him warmly, her handshake firm. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Briggs. The kids have been reading about Vietnam, but they've never met someone who was actually there. Just tell your story, whatever you feel comfortable sharing." Walter nodded, nerves jangling. He glanced at his notes, creased and smudged, and then folded them into his pocket. When Mrs. Finley introduced him, the room quieted. He felt every eye settle on him, the hush both unnerving and sacred. He began simply, "Good morning. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 78 years old, and I served as a Marine in Vietnam." The words sounded small, almost insignificant, against the backdrop of fidgeting bodies and tapping pencils. But then he looked at the children, the boys and girls on the edge of adolescence, some bored, some wide-eyed, all waiting for something real. Walter let the silence stretch. Then he spoke, not of heroics, but of friendship. "I want to tell you about a man named Mason Perry. He was my friend. We met in basic training, both scared kids far from home. We looked out for each other, sometimes in little ways, sometimes in ways that it just saved lives. He described the noise and confusion of battle, but also the small comforts, a letter from home, a lucky coin, the smell of rain on red earth. He talked about the day Mason was wounded, how Walter dragged him to safety. He kept his tone gentle, never glorifying violence, focusing instead on courage, loyalty, and the burden of surviving when others didn't. At first, the students were restless, but as Walter spoke, the room settled into a deep and almost reverent quiet. He saw a boy in the front row, eyes wide, fists clenched, leaning forward. A girl scribbled furiously in her notebook, her lips moving as she mouthed his words. Walter felt the fear recede, replaced by purpose. He told them how coming home had been harder than the fighting, how people turned away, not wanting to hear about the war. He told them about loneliness, about what it felt like to walk into a place like Maple Brew and be ignored or mocked. But then, he spoke of change. "A few days ago, I sat alone in a coffee shop, and people didn't see me, didn't see the years, the sacrifice. But one person did, and that changed everything." Mrs. Finley's students began to raise their hands. The first question came from a quiet girl in the back. "Oh, were you scared?" Walter nodded, honest and direct. "Every day. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right, even when you're afraid." A boy asked, "Do you wish you hadn't gone?" Walter paused, considering. "I wish there had been no war, but I'm proud I served. I learned the value of brotherhood, and that's something I carry with me always." More questions followed, about medals, nightmares, friends lost, and how he coped when it seemed the world had moved on. Walter answered each with care, always coming back to the theme of remembering. We honor the past not by dwelling on pain, but by helping each other heal. When the bell rang, Mrs. Finley thanked him, her voice thick with emotion. The students lined up, most shuffling out shyly, but a few lingered, offering thank yous and quiet handshakes. One boy, the smallest in the room, pressed a crumpled note into Walter's hand before running off. Walter unfolded it. "Thank you for being brave, so we can be safe. I want to be brave too." Leaving the school, Walter felt lighter, emptied of some of his burden, but filled with something new. Outside, Ethan and his daughter Sophie waited on the steps. Sophie grinned, her hair wild around her face. "My friends think you're a hero," she said. Walter chuckled. "Tell them I'm just a man who did what he could." Ethan placed a steadying hand on Walter's shoulder. "You made a difference today. You always do." They walked to the corner, sharing small talk about the weather, about Sophie's science project, and Ethan's plans to help organize more community gatherings. As they parted ways, Sophie surprised Walter with a hug. "Come back soon, okay?" Walter promised he would. On the ride home, he watched the town pass by. Quiet streets, flags in the breeze, people going about their ordinary lives. He realized that stories, once released into the world, took root in unexpected places. Perhaps a shy boy would find courage to stand up for someone. Perhaps a girl would decide to ask her grandfather about his own stories. Perhaps the town itself would remember to look twice at the quiet ones, to ask instead of assume. That night, Walter sat by his window, the marine pin in his palm. He was tired, but it was a good tired, a feeling of having faced something hard and come out the other side a little less alone. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that the wounds of the past could help build something better for the future. In the laughter of children, in the awkward, heartfelt thank yous, and in the simple power of a story bravely told, he saw the promise of a world learning, at last, to listen. For days after his visit to Maplewood Middle School, Walter felt a renewed energy in his step, like the old ache in his knee had been eased by something deeper than medicine. He had carried his memories for so long, like a heavy pack on his back, invisible to others but all-consuming to him, that sharing them in that classroom had felt like setting some of that weight down. The children's questions had lingered in his mind, returning to him in quiet moments. Were you scared? Do you wish you hadn't gone? How did you keep going? He found himself replaying the answers, refining them, even wishing he could say more. The days that followed brought a wave of change through Walter's small Ohio community. News of his school talk spread in unexpected ways. Mrs. Finley wrote a post on the school's social media page, thanking Walter by name and sharing some of the students' reflections. The post was shared by parents, picked up by the local news, and suddenly, neighbors who had barely nodded at Walter before now greeted him with genuine warmth. At the grocery store, a cashier, usually impatient and distracted, paused to thank him, her voice trembling. At the post office, an elderly man asked if Walter would speak at his church's men's group. Even the young professionals from Maple Brew crossed the street one afternoon just to shake Walter's hand, their awkwardness replaced by sincere gratitude. "You taught us something, sir," the bearded one admitted, almost sheepish. "We're trying to be better." Yet, with each new interaction, Walter also felt the resurgence of old wounds. Sometimes at night, the memories came sharper, flashbacks that snuck up on him, triggered by the scent of rain or the slam of a car door. He found himself pacing the house, restless, wrestling with a sense of responsibility. He had always wanted to honor those who didn't come home, but now, with so many people listening, he feared saying the wrong thing or falling short. It was Frank who noticed first. He called one evening, voice gentle. "Walt, you did a good thing, but you can't carry the whole world. Let us help." Walter wanted to protest, to claim he was fine, but he heard the concern in his old friend's voice, so he let Frank come over. They sat on the porch, sharing silence, and then slowly, stories. Frank spoke of his own nightmares, the guilt that never quite faded, the strange comfort of talking about the bad days with someone who understood. "You opened a door for this town, Walt, but you gotta walk through it too." Oh. The next Saturday, at Maple Brew, Walter arrived early for the veterans group. He found Dennis, Leroy, Carl, and a handful of others already gathered. There were newcomers too, young men and women from more recent wars, a woman whose daughter was currently deployed, and even the college student who had drawn his portrait that first day. Ethan had set up a bulletin board in the corner with photos, handwritten notes, and newspaper clippings, some from Walter's school talk, others honoring local veterans. At first, Walter was embarrassed by the attention, but when he looked closer, he saw that each photo or letter was not about glory, but about connection. A bridge between generations, a reminder that no one was alone in their struggles. During the meeting, a young veteran named Mike, quiet and intense, with tattoos snaking down his arms, shared that he hadn't spoken to his own father in years, too afraid of being misunderstood. "But I heard what you said at the school, Mr. Briggs," Mike admitted. "It made me want to try again. Maybe he's waiting for me to ask, not the other way around." Walter nodded, moved. Sometimes the bravest thing is reaching out first. You'd be surprised how many of us are just waiting for someone else to break the silence. Other stories followed, about regret, reconciliation, the fear of being forgotten. For the first time, Walter realized that sharing his pain was not just about easing his own burden, but about giving others permission to share theirs. The café, once just a backdrop for small dramas and morning rituals, had become a sanctuary, a place where the armor could come off and scars could be shown without shame. The meeting ended with laughter, plans for a community barbecue, and promises to check in on each other. As people filtered out, the cafe owner approached Walter, her hands folded nervously. Would you be willing to let us host a community night in your honor, not just for veterans, but for anyone who's ever felt invisible? Maybe you could say a few words, or just let people listen." Walter hesitated, overwhelmed by the attention, but Frank squeezed his shoulder. "You've already started something special, Walt. Don't stop now." The idea took root, stubborn and persistent. That night, Walter lay awake, thinking about what he might say if given the chance. He remembered the boy's note from the school. "Thank you for being brave, so we can be safe." I want to be brave too. Maybe, he realized, bravery wasn't just about surviving war. Maybe it was about letting yourself be seen, wounds and all. The night of the community gathering arrived. Maple Brew was packed, standing room only. Families, veterans, teenagers, teachers and neighbors crowded together. The usual hum of the espresso machine drowned out by anticipation. The walls were lined with photos and stories from across the town, wedding pictures, childhood drawings, letters sent home from distant lands. A microphone stood at the front, simple and unadorned. Walter's hands shook as he approached the mic, his Marine Corps pin gleaming under the lights. He cleared his throat, the room settling into a respectful hush. "I came here for coffee," Walter began, his voice trembling but strong, "and found something I didn't know I was missing. A community that listens, that cares. For years, I tried to carry my burdens alone. I thought no one wanted to hear about the past. I was wrong." He looked out at the faces, some familiar, some new, all expectant. "We all have battles you can't see. But if we share them, if we listen to each other, we become stronger. We honor not just our own stories, but those of the people we love." There was a pause, a moment where the room seemed to breathe as one. "Thank you for reminding me I'm not invisible. None of us are, not if we look for each other." The applause was thunderous, echoing off the cafe's walls and windows, and for the first time, Walter allowed himself to bask in it. Not out of pride, but out of gratitude. The boy from the school was there, waving shyly, his parents smiling at his side. Mike stood in the back, phone in hand, ready to call his father at last. And as the community night became a celebration of service, survival, and the quiet courage it took to stand together, Walter realized that the ripple of a single story could reach further than he'd ever imagined, touching lives and opening hearts long after the words themselves had faded. The days after the community night at Maple Brew seemed brighter, as if the small Ohio town itself had awakened from a long, indifferent sleep. Walter walked down Main Street and noticed the difference not just in how people greeted him, but in how they treated one another. Neighbors paused to talk in grocery aisles. Teenagers held doors for elders. Veterans nodded to each other in silent solidarity. It was subtle, nothing you'd see in the headlines. But to Walter, it felt like hope blooming where before there had only been routine. For Walter, the attention was still something to get used to. He never sought out the spotlight. In fact, he sometimes wished for the comfort of anonymity he'd worn for decades. But now, each handshake, each thank you for your service, each request to share a story or offer advice, reminded him that sharing pain could give birth to new strength. He was invited to more places, church groups, schools, the VFW, even a book club at the library where he found himself discussing not just Vietnam, but resilience, forgiveness, and the ties that bind communities. One crisp Saturday morning, Walter joined Ethan and Frank at the Café. The three sat at their usual table, sun streaming in, a comfort in their routines that now felt newly meaningful. Frank sipped his coffee and slapped a newspaper down. A local hero brings town together. The headline read, above a photo of Walter at the community night. Marine pin gleaming. Walter snorted, embarrassed. Didn't do it alone. Ethan smiled, folding his hands. You didn't, sir. But you started something. You showed people it's okay to talk, to remember, to care. Frank, ever irreverent, grinned. And you did it without burning the place down. That's more than I can say for you back in '68. Laughter rolled between them, real, rich, and free of the old heaviness. It was a small thing, but it carried an enormous weight. The sign of wounds healing not by forgetting, but by remembering together. Later that afternoon, Walter took a slow walk to the local park. It was Veterans Day, and a ceremony had been planned. Families gathered, children waving tiny flags, a brass band tuning up on the bandstand. The mayor, a tall woman with a kind face, greeted Walter personally, inviting him to stand with other veterans near the front. For the first time, Walter accepted with pride. As the ceremony began, Walter looked out over the crowd and saw faces from every corner of his journey. And Ethan's daughter, Sophie, grinning and waving, Mrs. Finley in her class, holding up homemade banners, the boy who'd written him the note at school, now clutching his father's hand. The trio of young professionals from Maple Brew, standing quietly in back, eyes bright. He even spotted Dennis, Leroy, and Mike from the veterans group, heads held high. A local priest said a prayer, and then the mayor called Walter forward to say a few words. Nerves fluttered in his chest, but he felt a steadying warmth as Frank gave him a thumbs up and Ethan mouthed, "You've got this." Walter approached the podium, the breeze lifting the edge of his coat, the Marine Corps pin shining in the sun. He cleared his throat and began. Most days, I'm just Walter Briggs. I come here for coffee, groceries, to see friends. But today, and every day, I carry memories of another world, a world of courage and fear, of loss and hope, of brothers and sisters who never came home. For a long time, I thought the best I could do was carry those memories alone. I was wrong. He looked at the children in the crowd. We're all shaped by the stories we inherit. Sometimes those stories are heavy, but when we share them, we turn pain into wisdom and memory, into strength. If you see someone quiet or older or carrying scars you don't understand, ask them about their journey. Listen, you might find you have more in common than you think. He paused, searching for words that would linger, the words that could honor the living and the lost. I want to thank this town for reminding me that no one is invisible, that our stories matter. Not because they're perfect, but because they're true. We all have battles, seen and unseen, but together we can be the homecoming each of us needs. A hush fell as he stepped back, then applause, steady, sincere, the kind that rises from shared gratitude and respect. Sophie raced up to give him a hug. The mayor shook his hand. Even the most stoic veterans wiped their eyes. After the ceremony, Walter wandered to the small memorial at the park's edge. He traced the names engraved in granite. Some he'd known, some he hadn't, and whispered a promise. You're not forgotten. Not here. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky gold, the crowd lingered, neighbors talking quietly, children running through the grass, veterans embracing with solemn joy. Walter found himself surrounded by friends old and new. Frank clapped him on the back, And Ethan said softly, "You gave this place more than you know." Walter looked around, seeing not just a town but a community awakened. A tapestry of stories, each thread stronger for having been seen. The past was no longer a burden he had to carry alone. It had become a bridge, linking generations and lighting the path ahead. That night, Walter sat by his window, a mug of tea warming his hands. He wrote a final note to himself, a habit he'd kept since the first day he'd started talking again. Real heroes don't ask for attention. But sometimes the world needs reminding of who they are. Don't judge someone by what you see today. You have no idea what battles they've already fought. And if you believe veterans deserve more than just a discount, share their stories, like this one, and keep listening. He smiled, content. The world outside was quiet, but in Walter's heart, the applause still echoed, gentle and enduring. For the first time in many years, he felt not only remembered, but at home. If you believe veterans like Walter deserve more than just a discount, like this story and subscribe for more powerful tales of real American heroes.